BioWare's Knights of the Old Republic may be known as one of the greatest games and arguably the best Star Wars game of all time. But what about its sequel, Knights of the Old Republic 2: The Sith Lords? With the 15-year anniversary of Kotor 2's release just a few months away, I decided to give the game a couple replays to take a closer look into Obsidian Entertainment's take on the Star Wars universe, and to see how my favorite Star Wars story of all time has held up over the years.
I have a bad feeling about this.
In 2003, when BioWare first released Knights of the Old Republic, little did we know it would become one of our gods' most prized holy possessions. Kotor was received so well that it would set the new industry standard in the world of RPGs, and would go on to receive Game of the Year and be consistently ranked as one of the greatest games of all time for years to come. Kotor's success not only solidified and put BioWare on the map as a developer, but it also revitalized massive interest in the Star Wars gaming genre. With Kotor's massive success, a sequel was a guarantee, so basically LucasArts called and left a message on BioWare's voicemail.
Yeah, hi, BioWare, Big George here. That Knights of the Laser Swords game you guys made was just great. Can you make that game again, but don't take 3 years, okay? Love you, Big G.
This pressure on BioWare to finish the sequel was intentional to capitalize on the hype and to have the game released before Christmas. BioWare's response went something along the lines of,
You serious?
BioWare then told LucasArts, "Suck me, we don't want to make a game in an afternoon." Luckily, with the success of Kotor, it would ultimately give BioWare the independence they have always wanted, which allowed them to work and focus on their own IPs and projects. BioWare would go on to spawn even more equally praised RPG titles such as Dragon Age Origins and Mass Effect.
We're bang, okay?
With BioWare declining to make a sequel,
Sorry, but that ain't gonna happen.
Kotor 2 project would then get passed to a brand new development studio that you may have heard of before, Obsidian Entertainment. Obsidian Entertainment was founded by ex-Black Isle Studio employees Chris Jones, Darren Monahan, and Chris Avallone shortly before Black Isle Studios' closure. With the massive success of its predecessor, the hype and expectations for the sequel were incredibly high, so LucasArts made sure to give this brand new developer team of about 30 members 14 months to make Knights of the Old Republic 2.
Hopefully it'll work.
Even though Knights of the Old Republic 2 would be Obsidian's first game as a studio, not only would they make the best possible game with the time given, but they would go on to make several other highly regarded games in the genre as well, such as Neverwinter Nights 2, South Park: The Stick of Truth, and Fallout New Vegas. Upon Kotor 2's release, it was met with mixed reception, and rightfully so. For lack of a better term, due to its rushed development, Kotor 2 was released in an unfinished state.
Well, that smells stinkerwith.
And in retrospect, its echoes can be seen all throughout the game, which unfortunately resulted in the game upon release being plagued with more than several bugs, along with a major chunk of its planned content being cut due to time constraints.
I may have gone too far in a few places.
All credit to the Obsidian Entertainment team, as they still created a larger and what I personally feel to be a more in-depth game than the original in a third of the time, as BioWare had 3 years to complete the original. So while Kotor 2 wasn't considered a bad game critically, and was reviewed rather favorably, it was still claimed by many fans of the series to be inferior to its predecessor. Now, I fully believe the mixture of Kotor 2's reception was mainly due to the two completely different tonalities and views on the Star Wars universe that were taken by each development studio. Kotor 2's lead designer and writer, Chris Avallone, took a game that was expected to formulate much like its predecessor, and followed the quintessential Star Wars space opera storytelling model, a model which typically flows very similar to Episode 4, A New Hope. Instead, Obsidian Entertainment turned this model completely inside out and gave Star Wars fans, in the form of Knights of the Old Republic 2, a much darker, grittier, more mature story that would not only break the mold for Star Wars games, but completely remove itself from the model of its predecessor and stand out to this day as one of the most unique Star Wars titles to date.
I don't like sand. It's coarse, rough, and irritating.
Much like Attack of the Clones, KOTOR 2's combat and visuals are disappointing, or stinky, whichever you prefer. As far as sequels go, the mechanics and the style of gameplay is honestly the exact same. If I had to rate KOTOR's combat and gameplay, I would give it a solid bingus out of 10, which roughly translates to European currency to about a solid 4. Because, well, most Star Wars games really try and emphasize on the combat and to relive and revive the feeling you get from the movies, the nostalgic rush of being in a lightsaber duel, the anticipation of the lightsaber duel and how epic it was.
I'm a virgin.
And then you get this.
No, don't do it.
This style of combat is clearly outdated to today's standards, and it's not a system that has totally disappeared either, as some similar titles like Dragon Age have implemented this style of combat in a way cleaner and more effective way. But for KOTOR 2, with its clunkiness and pathing issues, this system really just slows the game down and interferes with the player's experience. The combat system itself is basically molded after D&D mechanics, and in the background makes computer-generated rolls based on a 20-sided die to determine combat. Besides the addition of a few notable force powers and the removal of some unnecessary abilities, KOTOR 2 plainly adopts the same style of gameplay and combat mechanics as its predecessor. I assume not by choice. Obsidian knew that the combat system was outdated and they wanted to remove it and update it. But with time restrictions, Obsidian basically came to the realization that
it's stylistically designed to be that way, and you can't undo that, but we can diminish the effects of it.
as much as they tried, they succeeded to a certain degree. Definite improvements were made to KOTOR 2 compared to the original. With a lot of the cut content, thankfully, data miners and teams of modders have actually been able to bring back a lot of the original content available for the PC version, along with graphical updates and some game improvements in the form of the Sith Lords Restored Content mod, which is easily and readily available on Steam, has really allowed this game to be played fully as intended. If you haven't played KOTOR 2 or haven't seen the Restored Content mods, I highly recommend it, and I will include a link in the description. Combined together, these are all certainly features that have not aged well over the years. Along with the graphics, they're typical for the time and are actually pretty above standard for the early 2000s. There are definitely some wonky character models from time to time or some missing textures.
I am aware of the situation, Lieutenant. I do not intend to lose Telos twice. And I know that ship. It was a Malachor 5.
Personally, this isn't a big deal for me. I'm sure the older graphics could potentially deter some from playing the game, but I'm sure longtime fans of the series can still appreciate its unique charm and presentation.
It is a far greater victory to make another see through your eyes than to close theirs forever.
This is where the fun begins.
Now, despite some considerable changes and issues plaguing through development onto release, the writer's room is where KOTOR 2 shines. KOTOR 2 delivers a story and characters within it that are simply one of a kind. The writers accomplish this through the means of deconstruction, because through their love of the universe, they were actually able to appropriately and successfully challenge and critique it. Every aspect of Star Wars is touched on and deconstructed, from the simplest of questions to the most intricate of topics.
There's always a bigger fish.
Thanks, Qui-Gon. The best example of this is in the question, what is the Force? Now, I'm sure every fan of Star Wars has a slightly different answer to that question, but that is the quintessential topic that Chris Avellone poses to the player throughout the game. For the first time, and possibly last time, the behemoth concept of Star Wars and its universe was created and what I believe to be challenged by genuine fans. In interviews, Chris Avellone has gone on to say that he is a major Star Wars fan, has played all the games, read all the books, and when given the opportunity, crafted a Star Wars story reflecting what he found lacking, and to call into question the inconsistencies and undiscussed aspects he found to be at fault within the Star Wars universe. All throughout the game, the thematically posed question, what is the Force, is what Chris Avellone answers through the game. And he achieves this through the Force.
Ironic.
Because the Force has remained unspecified and vague, which was on purpose throughout all of Star Wars history, mainly to not oversimplify it, which would allow Star Wars to be understood by large audiences. So it's not really a surprise when, through the years of different adaptations and novels, comics, and movies, each form of media seems to develop and adapt a different representation of the Force and how it works and operates within the universe. With there already being so many different existing interpretations of the Force, Obsidian Entertainment said,
"Oh, I don't think so."
And responds with a view and understanding of the Force that is uniquely nihilistic, but also fits to serve the dark, mature story that it supports, which delves into the what next.
The true war is waged in the hearts of all living things, against our own natures, light or dark. That is what shapes and binds this galaxy, not these creations of man.
They accomplished this what next by putting major focus into making Kotor 2 a very personal game. Where its predecessor had you dealing with a galactic scale threat, Obsidian scaled everything down and brought a lot of the game's major themes and elements to a personal level, simply by placing an emphasis on fixing the galaxy rather than saving it, a viewpoint of the Star Wars universe that is rarely told or examined.
I cannot force you to listen to reason, only hope that you will grow past these infantile delusions of right and wrong.
So with Kotor 2 being set 5 years after the events of the original Knights of the Old Republic and 4,000 years before the events of the Phantom Menace, this deconstruction wastes no time and immediately subverts expectations upon starting the game. From the moment you start the prologue, you are greeted with one of the most recognizable icons from the original Knights of the Old Republic, the Ebon Hawk, completely destroyed and adrift in space.
She can't do that. Shoot her or something.
Not only is this a proper subversion of expectations that immediately bestows a tone upon the player that this game is going to be different from its predecessor, but it goes on and continues to give an eerie and almost haunting tone and atmosphere that builds throughout the game, which ultimately gives the urge that something is severely wrong, not only with the starting area of the game, but the galaxy in general. And this is paired along with constant thematic elements of being broken all throughout the game. Every world, every character, every companion is somehow damaged or wrong mentally or just physically broken. What allows this to work is the excellent writing of the Obsidian team, which naturally lets the player come to their own conclusions throughout the game with the information presented rather than just telling the player upright. Because throughout the game, slowly weaving lines between the dark side and the light side, they're blurred, and it brings a more deeper ideological thought process to every aspect of Star Wars, from the Force to the Jedi Code to the Sith teachings. Everything is touched on and woven together so beautifully. And this unique take by Avalon has changed the Star Wars mythos for me.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
The writing and presentation of story, the world, its characters, is absolutely unique and not found in any other Star Wars game title to my knowledge. That is Kotor 2's brilliance. It tells a story that, in my opinion, is a story that beats all other Star Wars titles in comparison.
Why do I sense we've picked up another pathetic life form?
Knights of the Old Republic 2 placed a main focus on its story elements as well as the companions that join your party. Your companions do play a major role throughout the story with their thematic elements and plot points. But I don't want to get too in-depth on the characters and potentially ruin major plot points and reveal too many spoilers, as I feel like this is truly a story every Star Wars fan should experience for themselves and take away their own thoughts and interpretations, which is an experience I don't want to rob them of. But I digress. One of Knights of the Old Republic 2's greatest strengths is achieved through the importance of weighted conversations, and how they're almost treated as boss encounters.
Apathy is death.
Apathy is death. Apathy is death.
Apathy is death.
Statement: apathy is death.
While it is pretty humorous, that's one of my favorite boss encounters in the game, and it's simply just all through dialogue. You're thinking all throughout this little boss encounter, and it just really gives you some interesting scenarios, but it's also light enough that it can poke fun at itself too. But you're also, through your thoughts and conversations, you're gaining story from it. The brilliance is this not only allows the player to come to their own conclusions over the natural flow of the game, but when that information is slowly trickled down and revealed to the player over time, just naturally through dialogue, it furthers the impact of the grand reveal at the end of the game. Because from the start of Kotor 2, it places an emphasis on dialogues and their importance, almost simulating a D&D-like experience, and rewarding you for paying attention and thinking through your options. Because instead of just seeing a wheel with 4 options of what to say, you are given your entire text, thinking through what option will get me further in the story and what do I want to say or unlock. That being said, dialogue is only one piece of this puzzle. What allows this to really work is the likable and relatable characters and companions that you encounter throughout your journey. Now, I could touch on every single companion, but like I said, I don't want to get too in detail, so instead I'm just going to touch on a few companions that begin to accompany you early through the game. Specifically being Atton Rand, Kreia, and Bao-Dur. Now you meet these 3 companions very early on in the story, which I presume is intentional, because not only are these first 3 companions some of the most interesting and developed story arc-wise throughout the game, but I believe they also directly represent key thematic elements and components of the game's main themes. I simply encourage any newcomer into the series to pay attention to these companions very carefully. The first companion you meet is Kreia, who will go on to guide you to feel the Force again and to mentor you, becoming your new teacher. Not only is Kreia a fan favorite and probably one of the more loved masters of the Star Wars universe, but she also encapsulates everything that the story is trying to tell you in one character.
It is such a quiet thing to fall, but far more terrible is to admit it.
Atton Rand is introduced to the player as what appears to be the stereotypical scoundrel Han Solo-esque type character, but through his arc, quickly grows and develops into his own character, which is fantastic because that gives the player a specifically intentional view of a non-Force user's perspective on the universe.
Just so you Jedi know, the whole cryptic routine isn't mysterious, it's just irritating. If you really can see the future, you should be at the Bazak table.
And finally, Bao-Dur, an engineer who you served with during the Mandalorian Wars. What's neat about Bao-Dur's character is that it allows you to see the war from a different perspective, from the engineer's perspective, somebody that helped engineer weapons of mass destruction. It just gives a different perspective into the Star Wars universe that has never really been seen before. Like I said, the companion storylines are crucial to Kotor 2 because they are interwoven with the main plot. Your companions that go on to follow you will mirror you in a lot of ways, your behaviors, your appearance, as well to certain degrees throughout the game, sometimes against their greater instincts.
Wait a minute, how did this happen? We're smarter than this.
Apparently not.
The extraordinary context that is Kotor 2 is how they found a beautiful way to canonize typical gameplay mechanics into a logical explanation and reasoning for your character and why they level up and why your companions join and follow your every move. It's one of the best storytelling elements I've ever seen included in a game. Now, let me preface this by saying I like every single companion in this game, which is rare. Most games have that one companion the fandom really just despises.
Yes! Oh, great and mighty Grand Champion! Is there something you need?
But for the most part, every companion is just as in-depth as the player character, and learning more about them and how you relate to them is not only a humanizing and humbling experience, but it gives more weight to your decisions throughout the game, because you care about their influence and you start to grow and learn more about those characters, and you generally start to care about them and what they think about you and how your interactions can affect them. Mark Grisky, the composer and orchestra director for the Kotor 2 soundtrack, accompanies you throughout your journey with his beautifully set orchestral pieces. The scores that accompany you through Kotor 2 further flush out the game's main elements, as it can really add and invoke a variety of emotions and feelings of unease and tension to calm and peaceful. And this really adds to the game's musical soundtrack just because it adds to the elements of the game. It fits right into the narrative that the game is trying to tell. The music also plays a part in telling that story. Mark Grisky's scores create some surreal sounding beauty, as well as pretty eerie atmospheres, which to a certain extent can almost be disturbing of a presentation.
I will bring his corpse to her, cast it at her feet,
It will be as if killing her children. I will kill all she protects, all she shields, until her hands are drenched in blood.
And the orchestral pieces do really feel like they are a part of the Star Wars universe. While not nearly as iconic as the John Williams compositions, I believe this KOTOR 2 soundtrack does do them justice and furthers the game's experience. Because as you wander through this broken version of the galaxy, you will hear this soundtrack a lot. The soundtrack is only about an hour long, so for what can be a 40 to 50 hour playthrough, sadly the soundtrack effects can start to diminish over the course of a playthrough, but thankfully the tracks aren't as intrusive as the original KOTOR soundtrack.
You asked for this! Down you go! Let's go! Ah!
And I think while repetitive, it still does a pretty good job in achieving this counterbalance between the tonal unease and tension and balancing it with beautifully calm and melodic Star Wars sounding scores.
This is getting out of hand. Now there are two of them.
After 15 years, and even though I was only 9 upon the game's release, Knights of the Old Republic 2 has had a tremendous impact on me over my lifetime. I've seen this game go through many personal lenses. I've experienced something new each and every time. Sure, its combat is clunky and the UI system, paired with a side order of fries and pathing issues, definitely has not helped the game age well. Sure, we are left with one of the worst endings and cliffhangers in video gaming history that honestly could have led to the most epic third and final chapter that sadly I fear we will never get to experience.
Always two there are. No more, no less.
You wish now that our places had been exchanged. That I had died.
KOTOR 3
had lived.
Yes. I wish that.
And honestly, this isn't any part due to Obsidian either. From all reports and interviews that I could find, KOTOR 3 has been brought up and proposed several times now and yet rejected. Unfortunately, it seems to highlight one of the main issues in gaming right now, is that the publishers are just pushing away from mainstream title games and more towards games that can simply be packed with,
you know, I'm here today as Luke Skywalker, but I'm also here to talk about Sprint. As you can see, you stand to save up to 17 cents a month over the more dependable providers.
All in all, Knights of the Old Republic 2 offers a completely unique story that isn't just a game, but an experience. This experience is one that I don't believe you can get at the box office, or in a book or novel. I fully believe this is a must-play for every Star Wars fan. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk on Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2, The Sith Lords.
Bye, have a great time.